Welcome back to Beyond the Wrench. My name is Jay Goninen, and I am your host. On today's show, we welcome Deron Lundgren from Subaru of America. Deron and I have had all kinds of conversations over the years on ways that we can help improve the industry. I think both of us are striving each and every day to try and make an impact. And we've talked about having you on, Deron, for quite some time. I think several years at this point. So glad to finally have you on, and welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So, how long have you worked at Subaru?
I've been with Subaru for about a year and a half, but been in the industry for a little over 14 years now.
Yeah, it's crazy. We're getting old, right?
I know, right? Yeah, I start making, we'll do advisor training and stuff like that, and I'll start making some like 80s, 90s reference, and it kind of just goes over people's heads, and I'm like, wow, man, I'm getting old.
Yeah. So, how did you get into the industry? I think you've got several manufacturers that you've worked for. I think you've got a lot of experience. But what kicked off all of that?
Uh, I'd say going back to being a kid, my dad got me into the most two expensive hobbies that you could think of, airplanes and cars. So ultimately, it got to the point where I knew I could probably only afford one of those two hobbies. So I got into cars and went through 4 years of woodworking in high school and thought that that might be a career path. And I went to Pittsburgh State, and I think he actually had one of my instructors on from back there, Mr. Norman. He's
We
awesome.
did, Scott.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep, good guy, good guy. So
amazing
yeah, I
guy.
went. So I was down there just checking out the school, actually checking out their woodworking program, and while I was down there, the instructor that I had in high school was like, "Hey, you need to go check out the auto program." So walked over and checked out the auto program, and I think within about 10 minutes, I pretty much had made up my mind where I was going to go to school. So I did 4 years of college down at Pittsburgh State. Graduated from there, went back to Kansas City because it was right around 2009, 2010 when the industry was in huge flux. So it was kind of waiting on some stuff to open up, and ultimately got a job with Chrysler, or FCA at the time, and started with them. Did about 2 years out in Southern California, just kind of going through their trainee program for about a year, and then switched over and became a district parts service manager in Southern California. And then I had a friend who was working for American Honda at the time and said, "Hey, it's great. Maybe you should come check it out." And talked to a few friends over there and talked to a few managers and interviewed, got the job, moved to Ohio, and was with American Honda for just shy of 10 years and held multiple district manager roles in Ohio, and was down in Texas for a bit, up in Chicago, and then moved into a staff manager role, and did about 7 years in Chicago. And then kind of got the itch to maybe go check out what this whole EV craze is all about. So I was looking at either Lucid or Rivian, and those two kind of jumped out at me. I thought the product was awesome and kind of wanted to see what the direct to consumer life was all about. Went to go work for Rivian for about a year and a half and launched the Chicago Service Center in downtown Chicago. And startup life it's tough, especially when you got a family at home and two kids. So realized that I need to kind of step back from that, and had the opportunity at Subaru to take on this zone after sales role, and stepped into this. Been here for about a year and a half and loving it so far.
So, what does zone after sales mean?
That I wear a million different hats. If you have any fixed ops related question, it probably some way, shape, or form is going to circle back to me. So, yeah, we do customer service, we do service training, but the only thing that I don't touch on is technician training because that would be a bad thing if I tried to do that. And then warranty help, helping with difficult customers when those come up, and just kind of resolving those problems. Um, Doing operational analysis, a little bit everything.
Talk to me a little bit about your time at Pittsburgh State. When I had Scott Norman on, that was something I learned a lot throughout that podcast. That's probably now been 3 years ago, 3+ years ago that we did that podcast. And as I've followed them and learned more about them, it's a powerhouse school in our industry. They do a phenomenal job. How was your time there?
It was great. The instructors were fantastic down there. They had two different programs, so you could do kind of hands-on technical training, and then if you wanted to step in and kind of take automotive management side of it, you could do that, or you could just take the 4 year automotive management, which wasn't it was still hands-on, but not quite as hands-on if you went to the 2-year program first. But loved it. Was down there for 4 years. Got to know all the instructors really well. Was part of the ASE club down there, and kind of helped run the car show for one of the years, and just had an absolute blast. I mean, I will say that the few ASEs that I did pass wouldn't have been passed if it wasn't for the instructors that I had, especially Scott Norman. So kudos to him. I think definitely wouldn't have passed my AC ASE if it wasn't for him. So, but yeah, overall, great time down there.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing where you were lucky to fall into that, right? Because I think when I was coming up, I wasn't really aware that there were schools with management type of training specific to our industry, right? And I think of Pittsburgh State, and I even think of Northwood University, our friends over at Northwood University. There are a number of really good programs throughout the US that, as a young person, I didn't really have a ton of exposure to, or even probably at that point even know that that's the route that I wanted to go. I went to more of a traditional tech school and was just there for the technical aptitude, right? And or the technical training. And I think hindsight's 2020, but I do think there's a lot of benefit in getting that management training early. I think it does open some doors for you. There are a lot of folks out there like me that were probably not willing to spend the 4 years in school, which, I think looking back, and just advice to a young person is that, if you look at it and that's something you want to do at some point, why not get that additional training up front when you are young and before you have a family? And, even if you don't, like, that's perfectly fine too. I know we've talked so much about the importance of 2-year schools and the technical training behind that. So, I think for everybody, we try to put everybody in a box, but ultimately it's kind of up to you as an individual. And I think it's pretty cool that you went that route.
Yeah, yeah, and then you were spot on. It opened up so many doors. Yeah, I'm sure Northwood and SIU and Weber and all the 4-year universities that are out there. It opens a lot of doors. So since you kind of go into a niche, which means, I mean, if you know you're going to go into automotive, it's great, and it's fantastic because a lot of the big OEs hire out of there. And I was looking to get on with an OE at the time, and Toyota was there, Honda was there, FCA was there, Ford was there. So I kind of had pick of the litter, and it wasn't just OEs. You had Sherwin-Williams Automotive Paints. You had all these different companies that you didn't actually have to go to them; they came to you. So a lot of the interviews you kind of go through the initial screening during like career days and stuff like that at the school, and if you made it to the next round, you get flown out. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I had multiple job offers, even though it was a little bit of hiring freeze coming out of 2009. But ultimately, had multiple job offers that I honestly do not think I would have been able to get if it wasn't for going there.
That is incredible. And as somebody that worked on the corporate side for a manufacturer going through 2008, 2009, that was very, very stressful. And the fact that you came out during that period of time was probably the least ideal time. I go back to, I think my brother graduated college at that same exact time as you did as a financial advisor. And he had walked into an office in Minneapolis on his very first day, and a guy was walking out with like a box and saying, "This is the worst profession you could ever go into," and like just leaving. So here he goes from college to walking into this gigantic building with the guy telling him not to go into the industry, which is something we hear a little bit about with the technician side right now, right? So it's not exclusive to our industry. It kind of was everything at that point.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting hearing the stories coming in as a newbie to the industry, all excited to what behind the ears, and you're just like, oh man, you wouldn't believe what we just went through. And I'm like, what? And then the stories start coming out, and you're like, oh no, what did I do?
I think it was the right call in the end. And as we go through today's conversation, that's one of the things that I'm really excited to talk to you about, just because of your ability to have really good insight from a bunch of different views. You have insight from the EV side. You have insight from a few different manufacturers on the automotive side, the traditional automotive side. And I think what we're going to talk about today is really something that everybody can learn from, right? Which is customer service. We're going to kind of take a deep dive into customer service on the service drive side and the service side of the business, and maybe see if we can learn a thing or two from Deron from all of his years being inside dealerships. So I want to start with kind of laying a baseline for this. How is it in dealerships? How is that customer service on the service side of the business?
Um, I mean, it's always growing. I'd say right now, especially, and I don't think it's really changed in the many years that I've been doing this. Is turnover is killer. And not having a stable staff or having enough staff or having the right staff on the service drive is kind of the base. And been talking a lot about that lately. Is we can only train so much if we're going to train a new face when we go back in. So having that good, I know you've had many podcasts where you talk about culture and making sure that the advisors have good communication from management to them and being transparent and just having that good foundation of a good culture, because that's going to help obviously grow people from coming out of as a porter or coming out as an express technician who maybe just is more interested in the advising role and kind of having that career path. But having that steady staff in place on the service drive, with a good career growth plan to where if they want to go into management, they can. But just kind of reducing turnover. That's been a hot topic for me, is just trying to figure out how can we reduce the turnover to where we have consistency, to where if a customer does come in, they don't see a new face every single time. Maybe they see that face, maybe they're not an express advisor, now they're main shop advisor, but at least they're seeing the same people, because having that good base and having that recognizable face when those customers comes in is really key.
We did an episode with Chris Craig, who was a service advisor and now does more of a content creator online, has really built a great niche for himself. But one of the things we talked about in that episode was the concern over the amount of service advisor turnover that we have in shops, right? Because I think we have a tendency to just focus on the technician side. But when you look at the turnover rates of service advisors, especially in dealerships, that turnover is frequent, right? And it's hard, because when you lose that service advisor that you work to train, and Chris made a lot of really good points in the episode we did, you lose somebody that has customer relationships, that has relationships with the service department, that has relationship, all the way up to the owner. They kind of see all sides, but at the same time, they're getting a lot of pressure from each of those sides. And when that becomes more than, maybe more pressure than what the paycheck is giving them, and it can be a very fruitful job, right? You can make really good money as a service advisor, but when the pain becomes more to stay than to leave, because of, like when it becomes more of a struggle than the pay is worth to you, that's where I think you see that attrition. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's maybe one of the foundational issues we've got in our industry on the service end.
Yeah, and I think that is probably one of the things that the independents to do probably a little bit better than a lot of dealerships. Is whenever you hear of, I got my gal or I've got my girl, it's usually because it's the same advisor they've been dealing with at maybe an independent shop that they take their vehicle to for 10, 15, 20 years. Now, does a dealership maybe have additional perks that the independent does? Yes, in many cases. But that longevity of that employee that they trust, and making sure that they're going to let them know the condition of the vehicle and not try to oversell them on anything, but just be upfront and tell them what they need to do and what needs to be fixed, and what can be done now, what can be kind of pushed off later. I think that independents do a really good job on that, and I think that's probably where you struggle if you do have that turnover in a dealership environment.
So you're working with service advisors all the time. Uh, is there any low-hanging fruit of things that we see out there that maybe we could improve as dealerships or shops or whoever it is? Because there has to be some things that you hear over and over and over again from service advisors as ways that maybe we could improve their lives. And I do think from a leadership position at a dealership, when you look at that, I don't know that we put enough importance in that role. I think that role is truly vital to a really well-run shop. Is there anything we can do that might not be that difficult to make their lives better?
Just listen, just
Yeah.
listen, get feedback from them. Honestly, is I think especially if it's a new service advisor that might be new to the role, never done any type of advising type role work, or maybe new to the industry, is just kind of help them get up to speed. And instead of, hey, here's your computer, here's your desk, shadow Bob over here, he'll kind of get everything, he'll show you the ropes, and next week you start. I think kind of slowly getting them in the groove and getting used to it instead of just kind of throwing them into the fire is big. But just listening, I think communication, I think is huge. What do they need? Is there any obstacles they're up against? I mean, that's a lot of the frustrations that, we'll hear from an OE perspective if we're doing training and it's maybe one-on-one, and they feel a little bit more comfortable talking to a third party on what it is. It's just kind of listening to what obstacles that they're up against. If it's something to make their job more efficient, what is it? Is it 2 computer screens versus 1 computer screen, so they can have multiple things pulled up? I feel like just listening to the employees and seeing what they can do to make their lives easier and make themselves more efficient is probably a good start. That's probably be the one thing that I would start with.
Just a good leadership lesson in general. And it sounds
Yeah.
so simple, but so few actually do it. And I think you can learn so much about their position and at the same time let them vent a little bit, because if they are getting that pressure from all sides and you can be an outlet for them to talk to, maybe it just kind of takes the pressure off of them a little bit or allows them to vent to somebody, because it might be tough for them to go vent to the technicians. It might be tough for them to go vent to the service manager or the dealer principal. But if you can be an outlet for them to just kind of release a little bit, I think that helps with longevity. I don't know if that's the entire core of it, but like when I say core, like as long as you're doing something off of that conversation, right? If you're maybe they're short staffed as service advisors, and I feel like I hear that all the time as a primary reason is that for that attrition is that a dealership is short staffed. They end up asking a service advisor to work way more hours than they should. And at some level, I think that's kind of changed about the dealership world. And I think this younger demographic coming up maybe isn't as open to working, 6 12-hour days or whatever it might be. And so as dealerships, we need to be on top of that a little bit, right? Like if we're understaffed and you can really see it, that's going to have a negative impact on your customer service, because if you're on the 12th hour of the 6th day, you're probably not in that great of a mood.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's definitely a big one too. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the turnover comes too. Is they're working those long hours and they're just stressed out.
Yeah, this is a very vague question, so I apologize for it
Yeah,
in
yeah.
advance, but how many dealerships that you see out there are short staffed on the service advisor front as a
Uh,
percentage?
yeah, yeah. I
I know that's a loaded question, but I think it might kind of open it up to some other stuff here.
Yeah, that is a very loaded question because what I feel might be short staffed might be a completely different opinion of the person I'm talking to at a retailer. So I'd say there's a little bit of that as well. I I'd say 50-50. I would say at least in the Subaru stores that I'm calling on in our region, where I feel like it's about 50-50. The larger volume stores seem to be the ones where that they might struggle a little bit. The kind of the smaller stores that had kind of have their turnover under control, they're usually pretty good. They might have 2 3 advisors, but the volume stores is usually where I tend to see a little bit of short staff. But yeah, if I were to put a number on it, I'd say 50-50, but more on the volume side stores where they might be short staffed.
And on the volume side stores, I'll defend the dealerships a little bit here too, because they're just so big that it's hard to keep getting good people in. And so that oftentimes puts you in that bad spot. And there's times even like in my own businesses where we've had short staffing cause difficulties within the business, but I've always been the opinion of let's wait until we get the right person, not just hire somebody. We say this all the time on the technician front, right? Like so many of us just hire a technician because they have technical aptitude rather than trying to see if they're a fit and will fit your culture and who you are and add to your culture. And it's so damaging once you kind of get in that mindset of, I just am going to do whatever I need to catch up on bodies. And I think it makes you settle on the quality of person that you're bringing in, and maybe settle for somebody that's not going to meet your values. And it really puts you in a bad position. I think that's what starts to eat at culture, right? Is when you start bringing those people in, maybe that don't match who you are.
And yeah, it might help in the short term, but if you're looking long term as well, I mean, if you're bringing in someone that you're kind of rolling the dice on, you're like, you know what, I just need a body. I need someone to kind of take over and start writing up service and get these customers processed. It's good for the first 3 months because you've got that extra body and you got the help. But when you start seeing surveys come in or complaints come in from customers, ultimately, you know what you're going to have to do in 3 to 4 months. You're going to have to let that person go potentially, or maybe find another role within the dealership to put them in. And then you're right back at square one all over again. And you're kind of starting over, and you're hopefully not quick to hire and then have to move that person out of that role. But yeah, I'd rather take the time, and I think you've had a lot of people on from some great organizations that have a good bench as well. So not just trying to find somebody with service advisor experience. And what I'm seeing now is usually if you're pulling from another dealership or maybe somebody who has past service advisor experience, uh, if they bounce around a lot, there's probably a reason why they bounce around a lot. And a lot of the success I've seen at some of these larger organizations is they have a good bench to pull from. So if they're coming off the express rack, or maybe they started off as a porter, or were maybe in sales department doing something, is having that bench to where whenever you do have that person that maybe got promoted into a management spot or had to move away for family reasons, whatever it may be, you can pull from that bench and immediately kind of get them up to speed a little bit faster instead of having to go through 2, 3, 4 weeks of interviewing to try to find the right person.
And I think it's interesting that you say that, right? Because as you're talking about that, it drums up stories in my head of some of the most successful service advisors I've seen didn't have an industry background. I've heard stories of people, meeting somebody at the drive-through window at McDonald's, or, at one of the fast food places, and saying, "Hey, if you're interested, come over here." And they'll come and put them into a good training program just because they have a good personality. And when they kind of match that good personality with a good training program and actually don't throw them to the wolves, they put them through some level of education, they end up with a really, really successful service advisor. And I think it's so much about the person rather than their history that, I think that's something we often overlook.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't want to say that there's not good advisors that you can't hire.
Right.
It's just I'd say from an ease perspective, yeah, it does take effort to kind of set up that bench and hopefully try to pull internally. And you'll get lucky and you'll get a good advisor, but I think it's very similar to the technician shortage, is trying to find a good advisor who can handle the stress. And in my opinion, the sales guys are probably going to kill me for saying this, but the service advisor position is by far the hardest job in a dealership. I don't care what anyone
Agreed.
says. Um, but yeah, just finding that right person who can practice proper time management and get up to speed and be able to deal with customers and handle the stresses of being an advisor it's not an easy feat for sure.
I also think that's how you kind of create those raving fans as well. You mentioned the familiarity piece of it. I have so many of my friends that go to a specific dealership because Bob's at that dealership, and Bob's taken care of me for the last 5 years and goes out of his way to treat me well and does such a great job that if Bob left, then I'm not tied to that dealership anymore. And, I think we are, again, I think we have a tendency to overlook the importance there. On top of that, the importance of a good service advisor to a technician, and really that relationship. I'm sure you've heard it over and over again, but if you go into a dealership and talk to a technician that has a service advisor they're not in love with, it can spiral out of control pretty quick.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. We started reading a book here internally in our zone from our customer experience manager. It was Unreasonable Hospitality. Uh,
Great book.
I I don't have a lot of time to read books because I've got two crazy ones at home. But I finally had the opportunity to listen to that, and I honestly just couldn't put it down because the restaurant industry is a great industry to pull from when you're looking for service advisors. And listen to that book, it is unreal how much parallel there is to the restaurant industry to being a service advisor. And the book is all about connecting with your customer. If you're a customer comes in and they have kind of a set expectation of what they're going to get. I want to get my car fixed and I want it fixed right. And hopefully they'll let me know the condition of the car. It's kind of basic expectations when they come in. But if you can build that connection and build that rapport with the customer, and that's when we do a lot of a service advisor training, is trying to focus more on that of, hey, where are points in that service transaction, either during the write up, to where you can kind of connect with that customer and build that rapport, especially if you're a new advisor and you're trying to build your customer base. Just being transactional is probably not the way to get that customer to come back to you over and over and over again, and essentially hopefully kind of turn that customer into a key tosser, to where that's where we kind of focus on, is finding those points in the service advisor or in the service experience to kind of build that rapport with the customer and turn them into a long-time customer.
One story out of that book that really stuck out to me was that how well they know the person before they even walk in the doors, right? They look up their Facebook information. They try to do research on them ahead of time so they can greet them by their name when they walk in. They have hand signals from the front desk to
Yep.
the servers to be able to tell them what kind of water to put out.
Yep.
It's just, they took it to an extreme level. They really, really did. And I think reading that does open up your eyes. And I love taking things from other industries. Another great book around process is The E-Myth. If anybody's ever read that, The E-Myth Revisited, just talking about the importance of process, maybe not as related to this conversation, so I won't dive into that. But like all of these books have a foundation in an industry that's not ours. And I think there's so much we can learn from those other industries. And that is probably one of the best books you can read ever for customer service. Just an amazing book.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a perfectionist as well. So listening to someone just try to operate at that high level and just try to bring perfection to the restaurant that he was running was, it was just cool to hear, because we try to do the same thing in services. Hey, how can we cut seconds out here? If it's in the express bay, what can we change in the process to tighten up communication between the technicians and the advisors, and doing hand signals. It's no different than having different colored hang tags for a main shop car, an express card, where you can quickly look at it. So you go through it and you start seeing the similarities between the two, and it was really interesting.
Is your shop looking to fill open positions or grow your bench of candidates? Consider adding WrenchWay to your recruiting efforts. WrenchWay helps shops and dealerships all across the U.S. find better qualified candidates for their service centers. WrenchWay Top Shop memberships are only $150 per month and include unlimited job postings on the best job board in the industry, a guarantee of 10 qualified applicants, and the shops choose who is considered qualified, access to connect with and help over 650 high schools and post-secondary schools, and much more. Learn more about WrenchWay's Top Shop memberships by visiting wrenchway.com and selecting the For Shops tab under the Solutions dropdown. Link is in the show notes. Let's dive into the customer service stuff. We talked about service advisors and the importance of that and their role in customer service. And you're working on some pretty awesome projects right now. And part of that includes listening to some phone calls, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's one thing I've been really kind of focusing in on is the inbound side, and maybe we'll get to the outbound prospecting a little bit later in the conversation. But listening to those phone calls and how they're being handled is one thing that I've been really kind of honing in on, especially as, at least in our market, the customer pay volume has kind of dropped a little bit. So every phone call that comes in my opinion, it's money on the other end of the line. That people's calling for a reason, and most of the time it's simple, just getting the appointment set up. But sometimes you're going to get people calling asking about a particular type of service, or hey, when I was in last time, they said I needed this major maintenance. What is that? How much is it going to cost? What are the benefits of coming there? Or hey, I called this independent and they're $150 cheaper. Why are you so expensive? So having someone on the end of the phone, being able to answer those questions is critical. But then knowing how to answer those questions is big too, because a lot of the dealerships, especially if they're large groups, they'll have BDCs that cover multiple brands. So they might be taking phone calls for Subaru, they might be taking phone calls for Honda, and then it might be a Ford call that comes in. And having that knowledge, you don't have to be an expert at it, but being able to answer those basic questions, having basic pricing, being able to talk about the benefits of coming to your dealership. And do you offer loaner cars? What's the transportation look like? If they decide to wait, what amenities do you have in the lounge? Do you have a quiet area to where if I'm going to go into a dealership and I work from home, maybe I need to take a call. Do you have a quiet area for that? Touting some of those things and kind of listening to that customer during the phone call is something that we pay attention to, because I would say in a lot of cases it's definitely lacking.
I think from a leadership standpoint, it's one of the least favorite duties of a lot of people to listen to their people's phone calls. And then on the opposite side of that, it's one of the most important things you can do. And I think as you go through, it really allows you to kind of build a coaching list off of, right? To be able to dive in. And it's just, when I look at that process and going through and listening to phone calls and then coaching off of it, so much of the coaching comes in the delivery, right? Because if you're just kind of bashing it over your advisor's heads, and this really goes for any sales position, I believe, you're probably going to fight resistance and people dreading to having that conversation with you because it doesn't come across as coaching. But if you can really get them to buy in from the start and say, the reason why we do this is that we want to help you become a better service advisor. We want to help you become better at your job. And I'm here to help you with that. And I think the impact, and it's a narrow line, right? Like you can really put somebody in a bad position if you go across the line the wrong way. And you can really motivate somebody if you go across the right way. But talk to me a little bit about that importance of delivery in coaching.
Yeah, that no, I'd say that's definitely important, and being able to kind of match the personality too, to where if it's a person that doesn't take criticism very well, then you kind of have to be delicate in the approach, and asking more questions, I feel like is definitely a good approach whenever we're doing coaching instead of preaching. I'd say that's what most sales managers, just in sales in general, we can kind of get in the groove of, we're under a time constraint. I've only got 15 minutes to train with this person. So then it just turns into a data dump. And then you're just kind of preaching to that individual, to where I prefer whenever I'm coaching even if it's someone in the BDC or someone with a service advisor, one-on-one's a little bit easier. Obviously, if you're in a classroom setting, it's a little bit different. You can only have so much conversation, or the training will go way too long. But in a one-on-one setting, I tend to ask them, what do you need help with? What are you struggling with, or what's one area that you feel that you could get better on? What can I help with today? Or going through and kind of looking at, if are collecting survey information. If you work for a manufacturer, you've got survey information, so you can kind of go through and see what customers are saying, either in general for the dealership or for that specific advisor, and just kind of talk about those areas, walk them through the processes of, hey, how do you do it? Hey, let's role play. A big thing is role play with me, of what does your write-up sound like, or if you're writing up or explaining a service, what does that sound like? If you get this type of objection, what does it sound like? And kind of role playing with the individual definitely helps. And doing that, letting them know what they did well and letting them know what they can tweak. If you immediately go to what they did wrong, then they're not going to want to come and ask you for help. It's got to be a safe environment for them to kind of train with. So I prefer to ask a lot more questions, and then based on the responses for those individuals of whatever position that we're talking about in service, is helping them that way and letting them know what they're doing good at, and then what they can kind of tweak. and still always coming at it from a positive approach.
What advice do you have for role playing? It can be a very awkward experience, especially if somebody's not done it in the past.
Yeah.
What do you find are some best practices there?
Uh, Man, it's kind of I would say it's tough. It's just there's really no advice. You just got to do it. Like that's the one thing is just maybe depending on the environment that you want to do in. It's probably tough to do it in like a meeting setting unless you've got someone that you work with beforehand and like, hey, we're going to do a role play. Do you mind playing along with me? Incentivize them. That's always nice too. Whenever we're doing training, especially if it's in a group setting, of we call it prizes of unspeakable value. So if you're willing to play along with us and do some role play in front of the group, then incentivize them a little bit. But if it's one on one, they're going to be uncomfortable. And like I always tell the advisors, I go, just imagine if you can get really, really good when we're role playing when you're uncomfortable, just imagine how great you will be when you're in front of a customer. So that's one thing is just you got to get over that hump. So whatever you do, just maybe pull some repair orders from the previous day, find some a particular situation to where if maybe they're struggling with their write up or maybe they're struggling with the active delivery at the end, whatever it may be, just say, hey, write me up. Maybe go onto the service drive, find a loaner car or a used car and kind of use it and literally walk through it like they're truly doing it. I feel like the more realistic you can make the role play, the more accurate depiction you're going to see how they're actually dealing with the customer. And then if you've got time I like doing observations on the service drive as well. And I call it real-time coaching to where they might get done writing up a customer and I might step in for a few minutes and be like, hey, you did a great job here. Hey, maybe try tweaking this, or this is how I would approach it. Everyone's different, but maybe try this a little bit differently next time, whatever it may be, or maybe try using this word track to try to define a little more clarity of whatever the repair is going to be, or what is the diagnosis fee might be, and what you're actually going to do, and what does it include. So just again, doing it, I know it's uncomfortable, but once you start doing it a few times, it starts to become a little bit natural.
I always liked in going through that one, I did like to lighten up the mood ahead of time so it wasn't so serious. But then when I use specific examples, I tried to use things that they would actually see. I've seen dealers make this mistake in the past where they'll maybe start off with their very specific scenario being an experience they had, 2 or 3 years ago that was very unique. And I don't know that you learn all that much there because, if it's something they're not seeing day in, day out, you have to get good at that stuff before you can get to those extremes. And
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, just kind of keeping an eye on and watching them as they're responding and seeing maybe where they're stumbling a little bit in their response or where they're having to think a lot about what they're going to say. You can kind of start to see points to where they need help, whether they know it or not. And the more you can get through that and the more you can get them to answer those questions very naturally, I think that's when you can see. And I think the cool part about role playing from a coaching perspective is that you can see things click almost immediately. Like when they click, it's like, now you got it. Like, that's good. You have something to celebrate now. And sometimes it's just a mental barrier or switch that if you can get through that, it kind of opens up a whole bunch of things.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a good motivational tool as well, to where especially if you're working with a new advisor, week after week after week and just kind of fine tuning their skill set, um, you're going to see that progression where they're going to get better and better and better. And as you're working with them and they start getting better and better and better, that's a good motivational tool. It's like, hey, you know what? Remember 3 weeks ago when we were doing this and I had these 5 things that you needed to kind of work on or work on your consistency on? You nailed it this time. Good job, Greg or Sarah or whatever it may be. So you can kind of use it as a motivational tool. And I think you were spot on as far as new advisors, especially new to the role, where they want to grow and they want to be the best advisor they can be. They can kind of get caught up in the process too. And we have to, we do a lot of reminding of that, of don't get so caught up in the process that you forget who's actually in front of you. Is if you're so worried about what you're going to do next, you're going to stop listening to that particular individual. You might miss things to where they're talking about their personal life to where you can kind of strike up a conversation and talk about their hobbies. So if you're so worried about what you're going to do next, you forget that the person's in front of you, and then it just turns into a transaction.
How much does personality play into the success of a service advisor?
Uh, I a big time,
Yeah.
as much as we don't want to admit it. And I think it might be, to me, it's almost kind of frustrating sometimes to where you'll see an advisor who is just has the process nailed down. I mean, they're the write-up is great. They're doing a walk around with the customer. They're talking about the condition of the vehicle. They're telling them about their car. Um, but then you'll see another advisor that kind of misses a few things here and there. It's a little loosey goosey, um, but they got the big old smile. They're joking around. They're having fun, and you'll look at the CSI scores between the two advisors, and from a process perspective, the person that might be a little bit more introverted, maybe may not get the best just overall gushing scores that the guy with the big personality has. And I think that's why we still preach process. Obviously, you got to have a process there, because if you're just kind of going off a whim, then it's never going to go well. But if you've got that personality that goes along with it, and you're just outgoing and smiling, and you feel like you're having a good time, and you're kind of giving off that aura that you enjoy your job, and you like what you're doing, the customers can feel that. And if you miss a few things here and there in the process from beginning to end, they're gonna pay more attention to how they felt than versus what you said.
I got really good advice from somebody early in my career, and it probably had such a huge impact on my career that they don't even know it. But I remember being young in my career, and I was on the phones a lot, and I was trying to follow the process. I was just overly thinking about it, and I was very tight and wasn't being myself. And we had like a company party one night, and we were just having a lot of fun, and really, a place where I felt like I could be myself. And growing up in a shop, it was kind of, you're out in your bay, like you don't show a lot of personality when you're working on the cars. Uh, yeah, at least I thought then. Like now looking back, I'm like, yeah, you can actually have a lot of really good impact with a good personality in a shop. But anyway, that person, my manager, came back after that week and said, "Hey, remember, like we just had this party and we had so much fun." And they're like, yeah, like be that guy. Like, don't worry about, like, we'll fix the process, we'll do that stuff, but have fun with it, show off your personality. And it was like the same thing I was talking about before, where the light switch kind of went, and it was like, oh my gosh, one, I can have fun and show that I'm having fun at my job, but then two, the customer feedback after that was insane. Like it was awesome. And at the same time, that helps you grow your confidence level because you can be yourself and you can have fun. And I think, that confidence level, as that rises, that just kind of leads to more. And that's one of those snowball effect things. And it was almost like I needed permission to be myself as a young person going into that type of role. And once I got that, then it was hugely impactful to my life.
Yeah, yep. And we definitely work on that to where, if obviously the process is always there, um, but ultimately it just comes back to communication. I mean, whenever you look at, if something does go sideways in service advisor world, then whenever you start peeling back the onion to figure out what the cause is, if you start too high level, it might be something specific of, oh, we forgot to do this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, as long as you are upfront, you let the customer know what to expect when they first arrive at the dealership and start going through whatever service it may be, and then you're constantly communicating with them. I mean, there's obviously certain things within the process that we can train on to help with that, but ultimately, if you set the right expectation and you communicate with the customer from beginning to end, everything will just come along. And while you're communicating with them, have fun, like kind of like what we've been saying.
Now, a big part of that service advisor's role is over the phone, right?
Yeah.
And we talked at the open about listening to phone calls and things that we can do that similar to what we were talking about with role playing. How do we use that as a tool to coach our people? It sounds really obvious and easy that, hey, I listen to them and then I go back with some notes and I talk to them about what I got out of the call. But is there a way to take that even further? When as it relates to to coaching them, is it role playing over the phone? Is it uh, picking out the points that they need to improve on, picking out the points that they're great at, and giving them feedback? Is it kind of a similar approach in coaching style once you're listening to the call? And maybe as you're listening to the call, what are things to look for? What are things that you can coach on?
I, a lot of it I feel like is very similar to service advising, to where if you're, especially if it's a BDC agent and that's all they're doing, and I think that's where I've spent a lot of my time lately is just kind of working with these BDC agents within these large call centers. Is first of all, you got to maybe a script. I don't like scripts, but there's certain things within a script that I'll usually highlight, and it's kind of bullet points of everyone's going to have their own word tracks. Everyone's going to have their own personality on the phone. But I feel like you got to establish first what's important and what do you need to, I guess, what information do you need to provide to that customer? If it's a loyal customer that's been returning, 3 or 4 or 5 years and they've been in, you're looking at their service history and they've been to the store 10 times and nothing about the dealership has changed, then maybe that appointment phone call is a little bit shorter. But establishing what information is important they need to talk about. A lot of the things that we hear misses, they will talk with the customer, schedule an appointment, but then forget about the other things of, hey, are you going to be waiting at the store? Or are you going to be dropping off? And establishing that. And I feel like why that's so important is if it's a customer that just in their mind feels that, oh, yeah, I'll drop off. I got a loaner car the last time. They're going to have a loaner car when I get there. I'll just jump into it. Well, if you're not establishing that with the customer during the appointment phone call, if it's for a diag or repair or whatever it may be, and they show up and you don't have a loaner car, that is a very, very quick way to send somebody through the roof. Especially, and then that means you've got the rest of the service to go through and kind of calm this customer down, and they already came in heated and they've only been there for 2 or 3 minutes. But if that was brought up during that phone call and establishing, hey, are you waiting or dropping off? Oh, I'm dropping off. Oh, great. What we do have alternative transportation options. We have rideshare. We've got loaner vehicles. If you charge for them, how much do you charge for those rental or loaner vehicles? And kind of establishing that too. And we've got quite a few stores that are in downtown areas, or maybe it's a weird entrance into the service drive. And especially if it's a customer that's never been there, look at the service history. If, hey, you know what, I don't see that you're in our records. This is the first time to our dealership. Are you familiar with how to get to our service area? Oh no. Well, when you come in, especially because we've got the downtown stores, sometimes you're gonna have to wind in, and what side of the building do I come in on? It kind of establishing that to make it where it's a little more comfortable for the customer to come in. So uh, those things get overlooked. But if you can kind of put that customer at ease or set those expectations up well before they even get to the service drive and actually talking about it on the phone, I feel like makes that transaction just go that much more smoother once they do arrive at the dealership.
I'm a big fan of, if you're going to start somebody out in the BDC department, having them go spend some time in the service drive, right? And really see the impact that might have, right? Where if you don't have the loaner set aside for them, or you really truly don't understand the process, yet we're throwing you on the phones to talk with customers, I think you're setting them up for failure. If you can spend a little bit of time with them in the service drive before they get on the phones, and in a lot of cases maybe they came from that side of the business, or they have some exposure experience there, but if they don't, I feel like you have to make that a little bit of a priority.
Yeah, yeah, I know that. I think when it comes to the types of services and just understanding, okay, well, what's in a intermediate maintenance or a major maintenance, and everything's going to be different depending on manufacturer. But if you have a 30K or a 60K service at a Subaru store, it's going to be a little more expensive than just an oil change and a tire rotation. and what is it, why is it needed. Whenever we do mystery shop, or we'll listen to phone calls and they're talking about those different maintenance packages, or um, you know, why are your brakes a little bit more expensive than the independent, or hey, you said you're turning rotors and I can get it done over here, they're just going to do pads and not turn the rotors. So being able to describe those differences and having a basic knowledge is nice. I Last thing we want them to do is diagnose on the phone or tell them what's wrong with their car, but at least have a basic understanding of what's in these intermediate major services so they can talk to it. Because we hear a lot of the times where they'll kind of go through it and they'll fumble through it, or they go through and they explain it and you're a little skeptical. You're like, they don't sound too confident about what they just said. I think sitting on the service drive and kind of familiarizing yourself with what's coming through the service drive, what does the write-up look like, what's in these services that we're performing on these vehicles will definitely help them once they get back into their BDC role.
Yeah, and it just again gives them confidence that they know what they're talking about. If they don't feel comfortable with that, that's where you can see that on the calls too, right? Is maybe you do get that call about turning rotors and you can tell normally in somebody's voice that maybe they don't know what they're talking about. And so if you can, in that scenario, sit down with them and maybe play back the recording or just talk through, hey, what happened here in terms of, it didn't feel like you were comfortable in your response there. Can you talk me through that a little bit? I mean, what's the best approach to go into that? You pick some things out of the phone conversation, and then maybe you're working with that BDC rep to get it corrected. It's more along the lines of pointing to that specific scenario and saying, okay, walk me through what happened here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's no different than service advisor role or selling cars. It's, if you got that recorded phone call, and that's the other big thing is you got to find time to listen to it, or even just do observations or sit with the newer agent while they're taking phone calls for 30, 45 minutes. Um, a lot of the times they just get thrown on the phone, and again, that's another area where you can find yourself being very short staffed because there's a lot of high turnover. So just getting in the habit of listening to phone calls. And I know there's a lot of software out there, software companies that actually will record it and then kind of give you notes, but not relying fully on that software to provide notes, but actually sitting down with those individuals to kind of run through it. But yeah, like you said, I think just pointing out those areas of, hey, this is what you did well on the phone call. This is what you need to tweak a little bit. Let's try this again, and then just do a role play. So it's not rocket science by any means. It's just kind of pointing out what they did well, what they can improve upon, and then just role playing through the scenario again, and then just continuously doing that and following up on it until they start growing.
I wish there was a way to do that without needing technology or a computer in front of you, because I think what happens, especially for business leaders, is you get into a scenario where maybe you're using an online software to listen back to the calls. And I think that's most cases. You listen back to the calls and you've got 15 other browsers up, your email's going crazy, maybe your Slack's going crazy, your messaging app. You've got all this stuff pulling at you. And I think a lot of times you end up listening to them at night or early in the morning, because there's no other distractions. And, if you're listening at night after a long day, that can be painstaking to listen to the calls and pull the notes out and, really figure out your coaching approach to that individual. So any advice or input there on when to listen to calls or how to keep your focus?
I Since I'm not working in BDCs and actually doing that, for me, whenever it comes to something, I just got to set time aside to where if it's a certain time during the week and just kind of block off time on your calendar. And in all honesty, in most cases, you don't have to go through a lot of phone calls to find stuff. The one thing you do have to stop yourself, because I've caught myself doing it, is going down a rabbit hole and listening for hours, and trying to find trends, because you're like, man, if they said this, okay, and then I'm honing in on a particular agent to kind of listen to more and more of their phone calls. And sometimes it can snowball a little bit to where you can listen for too long. And I think if you listen to 5 or 6 phone calls, the average phone call for us is normally 3 to 4 minutes if it's for an appointment. If it's something a little more complicated where they're trying to set an appointment for a diagnosis and trying to get some more information, then yeah, those phone calls will go a little bit longer. But if your standard appointment phone calls and kind of listening to the few questions that a customer might have, the phone calls are 4 minutes. So if you're listening to five, that's 20, 30 minutes. And over those five phone calls, you're probably going to find something that you can kind of tweak on. And if you just kind of get in the groove of doing that on a regular basis, that'll definitely help out. But I'm sure, again, I'm not too familiar with all the call recording software that actually kind of grade calls. But I know I know some of the stores that we do that use that and have it, they enjoy it. It kind of takes some of that time out of their week that they can kind of get back. And it's just, here's a few phone calls for you that you can kind of work with your staff on. So there's ways for you to do it internally, just kind of setting time aside, or there's definitely vendors out there that can assist with it as well.
Yeah. And I think if you go into it and you think it's going to be 3 hours of listening to calls and you are like, all right, I'm just going to listen to a whole bunch of calls all the time, it's not realistic for most people. And, I think when you do go down that rabbit hole, if you have a whole list of notes to go through, you're going to overwhelm the person you're trying to coach on that too. So, just keep it in small samples, right? And be able to pull out things that you can coach on. And then if you're doing it consistently over time, I think it's cool because then you do see those small steps, right? The small things that that start to go right. And just know it takes some time. I think we all want to go in and coach and have that conversation and magically have amazing service advisors that stay forever, great BDC reps. But you have to be realistic with it too. Like, not everything's going to go smoothly. Those calls, I know when I listen to calls, I dread that so much. But then if you can just face it and get through it and then have that coaching conversation, then it becomes a little bit more enjoyable because then you start to see a shift, or you should start to see a shift. Otherwise, it's the personality or the coach, or it's the person or the coach that something needs to change there. So I think that's great advice, kind of short bits.
Yeah, and depending on the size of the BDC too, I mean, you can always pair them up with a mentor as well. So if you've got that agent that's been there for quite some time, or maybe a floor manager or something like that in the BDC, depending on the size of it, that always helps too. But I know currently what we're working with, it's all over the board. So we've got, a large volume store that might have a BDC with 6, 7, 8 people, maybe up to 15, depending on the size of the group, to where if you can pair them up with someone who's doing really well, and kind of have them listen on the phone call as well, and kind of give pointers as well. It's no different than kind of pairing them up with a seasoned veteran service advisor on the drive. But then if it's a smaller store where they've got one person on the phone, then yeah, you're going to have to take some time. Either management or someone's going to have to kind of work with that individual and kind of get them up to speed.
One observation that could help the lives of BDC crews out, and this is just a observation that I have, might be an unpopular one. Can we get some BDC folks some windows every time you, like, for me, when I'm walking into a BDC area of a dealership, it's like they're tucked away in like this back closet area, and there's no windows, and just kind of their little cubicle. And I'm like, my goodness, can we get some light in here?
Yeah. No, I got a coworker that I work with, and that's one of those big things whenever we're trying to get a BDC up and running with a couple people. We're like, can please, let's make it fun, have fun throughout the day. They don't need to show up at 8:30 in the morning and just be in this dark hole that no one comes in and talks to them. Everyone just calls in. They don't go visit them. We're like, can we please just give them something to look at, have some fun in there, just make it a good place, because being on the phones for 6, 7, 8 hours out of the day is it's
hard.
Probably it's not easy. So being able to see sunlight is probably very helpful.
That's not just me then, thinking that the BDCs are like, yeah, we got this. Let me shovel some stuff out of this spot over here. We'll just we'll stick you guys over here and call it good. I think even from that level, right? Like, you get BDCs with some some turnover as well, and like being able to make them a little bit happier. Again, I think that helps that customer experience. Service advisors, and honestly, would love when they're next to each other or close to each other, just to be able to kind of feel like you're a part of that team. And I know it's not always possible in every single building, but I think when you consider how impactful that can be to the sales of your service department, it probably should be something you take pretty seriously.
No, that brings up a good point too, to where we see that, to where communication between service management and then the BDC management is critical. And it can be tough, especially for the larger BDCs where they might be covering 6, 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10 rooftops or more, but staying in constant communication with them. It's even more important, I feel like, when you're doing outbound, and prospecting on the outbound side to try to get customers to come back in. But even from the inbound side of, if you're backed up or something happened in the shop, or just some issues that keep coming in repetitively, or maybe you're getting a lot of status update phone calls, like that type of information is great to kind of go, to provide back to service management. But if they're having questions or issues that the BDC is seeing on a continuous or a trending basis, having that open line of communication between the service drive and the service management is critical, to where I do see that sometimes, to where there's a little bit of a breakdown where they're not meeting regularly, they're not talking through certain things, whatever daily operational things that they might be up against. Having that consistent communication on a daily basis is critical too.
We'll have to do an episode of like BDC, the forgotten department, at some point.
Yeah, yeah, and I think finding the right people too, to where I don't know if you've seen it, but a lot of the things that we'll see is we'll just get the receptionist. She's got some downtime, and she'll start doing it, and she got hired on to do something completely different than maybe even taking phone calls or prospecting phone calls. So having the right people in the BDC is critical too. And looking at it as a revenue generating role. I mean, obviously it's more revenue generating if they're doing outbound and focusing on due for service or overdue or declined service, open recalls, something along those lines. And I think, what was the analogy one of our coworkers used? It was really good. He's like, inbound's like collecting taxes. It's always going to be there. You're always going to get it. But outbound is like panning for gold. You're going to be doing a lot of work until you can get someone to say yes. So if you're doing outbound, it's two completely different mindsets in my head as well. As so having that right individual who kind of has that a good outgoing personality, is good on the phones, but they also they got to have some type of salesmanship as well, especially if they're doing outbound. And even on the inbound side, if someone's calling in for pricing, if they're calling in to get a price on something, there's a reason why they're asking. That means that they're calling around to potentially go somewhere else. So being able to identify that when a phone call comes in, if someone's asking for price, or how long does it take to get an oil change done, being able to say, hey, have you actually been to our facility before? No. Well, then tell them a little bit about it. We have express service department. It's actually a department where we can get you in an hour or less. We're also going to wash your vehicle while you're in. We'll do a multi-point inspection. Talk about the things that are the benefits of coming into the dealership to really sell the store. And if you're just throwing someone who was maybe scanning documents in the back office, or the warranty admin or something like that, maybe that's not the right individual to be making those phone calls.
One last point I'll make there to what you're talking about with making sure you add the value, and I use this example of, we have a local basically gas station chain, and they are top notch at everything they do. But one thing that irritates me, and some people love it, but what irritates me is part of their process is when you leave, the person that checked you out has to say, see you next time. And I think they must have cameras on them, because there's times where I'm like out the door and they're like, see you next time, like yelling it. And I'm like that feels very, very forced in my eyes. But then when I look at the conversation that a lot of our people have in our industry, I see some similarities in that you have to know the time and place to drive that value, right? Because if you're just trying to force it in at the end of a conversation because you were coached on, hey, I'm supposed to be adding, these value added statements into this call, it can feel forced and very unnatural to somebody. But when it's done right, it feels really good, right? And I think, for a lot of people, especially new people, they're trying to follow the rules, they're trying to do everything right, and it ends up with them forcing it into a very awkward part of a conversation. And so being able to get that across to somebody too, and a lot of times maybe it doesn't feel the most natural to that person, but again, going back to role playing, the impact of it, and maybe trying to get that in there of, hey, what we're talking about with value, could you try to get that into this conversation that we're going to have next, and maybe hopefully coach them in a way that doesn't make it as unnatural.
Yeah, no, that's critical too, because I mean, I don't work on the sales side, but they do a needs analysis, obviously, whenever you're looking to buy a vehicle. And if you just start just kind of going over everything on the car, and it has this great technology, has that great technology, safety features, and the person is looking at a WRX STI or something like that, maybe they're not worried about it. Maybe they're more worried about the performance side of it than they are the safety side of it. It's again, it's all sales. It doesn't matter if you're selling cars, selling service, selling parts, whatever it may be. Is listening to that individual and what's important to them, to where if they are calling in and they mention time, well then tout about what you can do to make sure that they get out in a timely fashion. If they're talking about, well, what kind of parts do you use, well then talk about factory replacement parts or OEM parts, and kind of listen to what they're telling you. And like you're saying, instead of just trying to throw stuff in there just because that's what your manager told you to do, or that's how maybe that's what's going to sell it. They're all great points, but if you start saying things that are irrelevant to that person, it's just not gonna resonate. So listening to those questions that come in tell you a lot about what's important to that individual, and then you've got 10 great things that you could potentially pull from. What are 2 or 3 things that are important to that customer, and that's what you build the value in, instead of trying to build the value in all 10.
It's a great way to end this discussion. I think we're just barely scratching the surface. I think I knew going into this conversation, based on every conversation I've ever had with you, Deron, that we would probably go a little long on this one, and we did. But it's because you do have so much great insight and really do care about the industry. So I appreciate you taking the time today. I would be remiss, for those that are watching rather than just listening. Deron's got a cool background today, and can you tell me a little bit about this background and why you have this background today?
Yeah. So we are remodeling our office, and I was trying to go in there and do the podcast there where it was going to be quiet, and that didn't work out. And so I've got 2 little ones upstairs, a 1-year-old and a 4.5-year-old, and they're very loud. This is probably the only quiet place in the house right now. So I figured, what's the one place that they can't open the door in? And I figured that was the garage. But yeah, behind me, I got a 1955 Chevy pickup. That was my grandpa's that he bought in 1957. And after many, many years of trying to pry it from my uncle and my dad's hands, they finally gave it to me, and did a little LS swap in it. So it's a good driver. And now being in Colorado, it is an absolute blast to drive up in the mountains. We took it up to Breckenridge about a month ago, and it was a phenomenal drive. With it having LS, it did great. So no, I'm absolutely loving it out here. Yeah.
And for those of you listening, it's a gorgeous truck. I love the sentimental side of anything, and to hear the story behind it, and that it's still in the family from his grandfather, is such a cool story. You're full of cool stories, and we love having you on, and hope we can do it again here sometime soon.
This was a blast. There's always something we can talk about, Jay. Yeah, like you said, every time we do talk, I look down at the clock and I'm like, I got to get back to work. I'm sorry.
Well, I appreciate that and appreciate all the conversations and support over the years. So I look forward to that next time.
Definitely. Thanks for having me on today.
That wraps up another episode of Beyond the Wrench. If you liked this episode, please show your support by rating and following the podcast. You can also watch the video interviews on WrenchWay's YouTube channel. Speaking of WrenchWay, did you know Beyond the Wrench is managed and produced by the WrenchWay team? WrenchWay is an online community dedicated to promoting and improving automotive and diesel careers. We help technicians find the best shops to work at, and we also help auto, diesel, and CTE instructors get more support from local industry. You can learn more by visiting wrenchway.com.